Hi, John.
I know I'm always last.
Oh, but I'm glad you're here. I felt sad when I heard you'd been to Tuesday last week.
Yeah.
I missed you. That's
That Judith?
talking. That's
That is
Judith
Judith.
talking, yes.
Judith, did you wish me happy birthday? I
Did
think
you
it
have a
was you,
birthday?
and I
Yes,
called
thank you.
you back.
You called me back. Yes, I figured you knew even though I didn't say my name.
No, it didn't sound like you. You sound like you now. You
Oh.
must have had a cold and it was early in the morning or
No.
something.
Well, yeah, it was early in the morning, that's true.
So as we start into the next few chapters, let me tell you kind of what's happened. First two chapters are kind of more introductory, where today he begins talking about different arenas, if you will, where each arena has ways that we can, first of all, identify racism, also approach racism, but maybe most importantly, how we can determine what we will do about the racism that we see. Because all of us, what we're trying to figure out is, what do we do? And even though, if you're like me, you would like to have the magic wand where you can magically fix every bit of it that you see, can magically change the whole world, as a practical matter, you have to figure out what it is, where it is that you will insert yourself in the midst of everything. What are the important things for you to do, and where can you do that life-changing work that is right for your spirit? And that comes to each of us differently. I like how he, throughout this book, continually refers back to the places in his life, either what he experienced himself or what his parents experienced, how somebody got to a space where they had to change and see things differently than they had before. And for him, this time it was that third grader who goes into this school, meets the one black teacher in the school, a school that teaches mostly black students. And he essentially just says, why? Why are you the only black teacher? Why isn't it that there's others? And he's not even necessarily questioning whether or not that teacher or any of the other teachers in the school are good or bad. He's questioning the system that doesn't have more of the models for the students that are in that school. How does he, as a black student, learn from the adults that are around him? And what is the best way? What does he need to learn from people who have some of the same experiences as he does?
Yeah, I think we tried.
But that's the challenge we all have to do. And specifically this week, he looks at power. And he says, when all he sees are white people in positions of power, when he sees only teachers who don't bear his color of skin, what's it tell him about the possibilities for himself? No matter how well those teachers teach, what does it leave out? Now, it shouldn't be an enlightenment to you to know that power is one of the main reasons why we do racism. We do it because we want to have power over something. We want to have control in our life. We want to take care of our own, oftentimes at the expense of others. If I only take that power for myself, what do I leave to the people around me that don't have that same position? So where is it in your life that you've enjoyed power at someone else's expense? Where have you been where you've been in a position where you got to dictate to somebody else from your power space?
I'm thinking about as a nurse with a patient that's vulnerable because of their illness.
Right? That's a really good example, because that that person in front of you probably knows their body pretty well, and you may have the medical expertise, but do you know that body?
No.
And yet, as the person who is sick, they're often in a space where they struggle to be able to identify themselves, the illness themselves. So how much do you trust them versus how much do you just be the expert?
Raising my children.
Raising your children is right. Because it doesn't matter how much your parent point of view matters and is correct, that 8-year-old sees it from a different point of view, a different
And I
height
brought
even.
that one up for a specific reason too. We talked about it on Tuesday.
Uh-huh. Go ahead. You muted yourself, Leticia.
There is an undercurrent in conversations between minorities and white, or ethnic groups and whites, where it's, we just have to help you. We just want to help you. And it's a very parental tone that's used. And it doesn't advance conversations, and it doesn't make the listener feel empowered.
I've had that situation where I was hiring people back when I was in the wine business, and I'd have to hire, we called them wine consultants. They were sommeliers, and they'd go to people's homes. And I tried to hire people of color, but the experience that I kept on running into was maybe not blatant racism, but it was racism. People felt more comfortable, white people felt more comfortable with a white wine consultant working for a German company than they did with a Hispanic, Latinx nowadays, or black wine consultant. And I found myself really struggling with that because, you know, I wanted to hire these people, but I also wanted to, like you said, be parental. I wanted to warn them, or, I mean, they must have already known, but that it was going to be more challenging possibly for them, that they were going to have more obstacles to overcome in wine sales simply because of their appearance.
Yeah.
And that was a position of power, and it was a horrible position to be in.
But what an interesting example to place before us, John, because I can't imagine that a black man can't develop every bit of the skill.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And I can't imagine that anyone wouldn't see that, but somehow in our society, because of those hierarchies we've built up, there's a lot of places where it's very simple to be able to say, this man, because of the color of his skin or because of his gender, is superior.
And it wasn't even superior, you know, it was, you're in sales. And in sales, the job is to sell. And, you know, I remember one time going to a wine tasting that was held by a Mormon family in Denver, right across from the temple. And of course, they closed all the windows and the shades and everything. And,
of course.
And so you'd run into situations like that too. That was an interesting job, but it was also very frustrating because it really did show all of the aspects of our society when you go into people's homes and sell them wine, because, you know, they didn't buy wine just based on how they liked the wine, but they bought the wine based on the presentation that you gave them, you know, the song and dance. And it was easier for me in a lot of situations. I remember one situation where it was the opposite, when I was teaching somebody in Kansas City, and I had a guy that was a black guy that I'd hired who was a former professional football player. And we went into a black part of Kansas City and had a tasting. You know, I was at that point supposed to be training him. and we had a tasting, and I stood out like a sore thumb in that situation. And I remember the mother reprimanding her teenage children for some remarks they made about the white man being there. So, you know, that happened too. It's a real complicated situation when you're hiring people.
It is. And part of it is that long history of whatever we've taught ourselves and whatever we've placed into our surroundings for so long that we no longer question it. At one point, the author said, race creates new forms of power, the power to categorize and judge, to elevate and downgrade, to include and exclude. And the longer that something, some person, some trait, some way of being is included or excluded, the more it just becomes normal for us. In any space that you're in. And the more it makes it difficult for me to look at you and actually see John instead of whatever else I see because of that which I don't question any longer.
Yesterday, I was putting out a sign for Proposition 208, which is not the most important proposition. 207 is, but 208. And the sign had blown down or something. And these two guys drove by, Latinx, is that what I'm supposed to say now? Guys.
Latinx.
And they said that they'd seen some white guy take down my sign. And I was just so tickled that maybe they thought I was a Hispanic or a person of color or something. But yeah, it was interesting because they identified the guy that he hadn't taken down my sign. He's the guy that gave me the sign. He was one of my neighbors, but they called him, you know, they said, yeah, we saw this white guy. So it's just endemic. It's everywhere.
Yeah. And much of that is because that's what we've allowed race to often do. It defines things, oftentimes in ways that we shouldn't define it, right? When I look at a Black woman, it's not that the Black doesn't give some definition. It's not that the woman doesn't give some definition, but there's a whole lot more to that person than just those two things that are very easily identified.
Mm.
And what do I do to go beyond just that? And the more I'm dealing in a space of power, the less I have to worry about that other stuff. Leticia.
We start playing semantics too for power.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
That white guy that took your sign, that's a response to being objectified as a brown person all their lives. So they're going to turn it around and say, you know, that white guy Jim over there.
That's right.
And when we started white fragility, I kept hearing, I have this Black friend who.
Yeah.
And at one point I said, why are you qualifying it? Why aren't you saying, I have this friend Jerry, I have this friend Geraldine, whoever.
Right.
But we're qualifying it, and it's a form of objectification that until we learn to remove that, the conversation isn't going to advance because you're not like Jim's asking the homeless lady what she wanted to be called, what she'd like to be called. Right?
That's right. She wants us to notice her, not some of the ways we identify. But the problem, of course, is that especially in this chapter, they identified this whole story of Prince Henry and how he began to define Black as slavery, right? And that's a long time ago that started. Mm. And so much of why we identify that way is hidden back in those annals of time. and in those habits that have been passed on to us in such a way that we no longer think about it. Okay, now to be fair to Prince Henry, because I think he's right to reject Prince Henry. To be fair to Prince Henry, there have always been slaves. I had a friend of mine who posted a thing that said white people have been slaves, Hispanics have been slaves, and that's all true. But here's the difference about what happened here. This was a shift as we were moving into the Enlightenment and moving out of the Dark Ages. Before that, most of our lines were drawn along country lines. And so I would attack into your country, capture slaves of whatever color they were, but that weren't my country's people, and would enslave them. And you might come back in and capture mine and enslave them. And that has been done throughout history. At this point, Henry specifically went and said, let's capture blacks and identify them as lesser than. It wasn't just Henry, it was all the people who told the story around Henry's actions, which gave a justification of why it was okay. See, that's a power space. I'm more powerful than, I'm a better human being than, I'm whatever, which denigrates the other. And that's what changed in this way. It wasn't just a nationalistic, I'm conquering you, but it became about ethnic and power.
And I thought that was interesting in the last chapter when they were talking about David Hume, and David Hume saying that races were created unequal. And I forget exactly what he said, but something to the effect of that the only great civilizations have all been white. And, you know, that was hilarious because you think, okay, so Egypt wasn't a great civilization. China wasn't a great civilization. The Indus River Valley, Mesopotamia, all of those civilizations weren't great civilizations.
The Inca Empire, which is continuing.
The Inca, yeah. I mean, I actually did get to that. I read that and I said to Diane, how could anyone be that arrogant? The only thing that I could figure out that white people were better at was imperialism. We were great at enslaving people and then, you know,
yeah. But of course,
taking over everything that they had.
But of course, John, you know why we as white people think that only white nations have made the great nations. It's because we tell the story from a white point of view. And so we tell the history of white civilization. And we even tell it in ways that makes it feel like, even when we're talking about somebody of a different skin tone, that they're still white. We talk about Marco Polo and we act as if he's European. Not Marco Polo, but Genghis Khan as he goes into that.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry,
was he Italian?
I said that wrong. But even saying Marco Polo, who was a darker skinned Southern European, right? Who today we might have some prejudices against. We don't talk about that. We talk about it as our white history. Go ahead, Leticia.
Yet you don't talk about the Moors when they invaded Europe and said, what barbarians, they don't wash.
Yeah, no, but
yeah.
Let me take that even a little bit further though. What we don't tell about the Moors, who often were darker skinned, they saved European history. Mm-hmm. When we went into those dark ages, what emerged out of it of importance was mostly because the Moors saved it for us. We don't tell that story because they were always the enemy, but they were the civilized enemy while we were the ones caught up in this fear-based space that made us hide from.
Well, and let's face it, we wouldn't have mathematics if it wasn't for the Middle East. We use Arabic numerals, right? Yeah. The Middle East was the center of civilization too for 1,000 years. So for David Hume to have the arrogance to say that all the great civilizations had been white, you know, and then the next person they mentioned was Thomas Jefferson, who, you know, was the definition of a similarist, I guess. You know, he thought Sally Hemings was, you know, she was attractive because she was so fair skinned and everything. You know, she didn't have black features. And I remember him talking about, you know, how unfortunate some of his slaves were because they were so African looking. You know, white people are just incredibly arrogant. I look at myself, I see how ugly I am. But, you know,
I'm just kidding, John.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying, you know, what is that psychology? You know, it's the opposite of cognitive dissonance. The idea, there's just an editorial or something on it. You know, the idea, the top to bottom thinking instead of bottom to top, where you have an opinion, and that opinion you find other justifications to support whatever that opinion is, and you ignore everything else. I forget what that's called. Right. Who's the psychologist here?
That's right. But much of what you're talking about, John, is trying to figure out how to very intentionally and deliberately look at life differently. I have to look at my privilege, my power, and decide, is it fair for me to continue to wield and benefit from that power at other people's expenses? Right? It's not wrong that I have power. We all have power of some sort or another. It's if I use my power in a way that hurts somebody else. And kind of like the question that I asked, I think, before we started, if I feel it's right for me, why aren't I fighting to make it right for everyone? If I'm just assuming that this privilege, this ability is mine to enjoy and my right to enjoy, then that's where racism comes in, or sexism, or whatever it is, where I'm unassigning somebody the ability to do something that I consider right for me. Go ahead.
I started out saying that I taught my children how to take advantage of white privilege. Actually, what I told them is, you only say you're Latino if you need the assistance, which caused them, and in those conversations, they asked why. But they grew up with the last name of Trog, T-R-O-G, and Johnson. And one's Johnson, one's Skaggs, and the other one's Jennifer's still a Trog. She didn't take her husband's name. If she did, she'd be a Miller. And they're all light-skinned, fairly light eyes, light complected. So, but in doing so, they never use white privilege at the expense of somebody else. And that's what my daughter told me a couple of weeks ago. She called and she goes, having to go through all this, because she works in a college setting, so she's having to go through all these same classes. And her acknowledgement that I raised them very deliberately, because I'm 58 years old. I'm old enough, and I had older brothers and sisters. I'm old enough to remember the late 60s, remember watching what was going on, remember the conversations. So some of us went on past you guys that worked in the 60s, but it wasn't easy for us because a lot of it was forgotten in our generation, or it wasn't passed on.
So let me turn the conversation in a slightly different direction, but that kind of builds on top of this. I think much of what we're talking about so far when it comes to power posits a limited amount of power. There's only so much, and so you have to hoard as much of it for you at the expense of someone else. I think we get that from things like survival of the fittest, right? That only the strongest, the best came out of. And yet, whether we talk about the plant world, the animal world, or human world, the reality is that much of that survival happened not because of competition, but because of cooperation. That somehow we figured out how to band together in a pack of wolves that then hunted better than a solitary wolf. And it was that learning that really advanced things, not the competition type of thing. That there was enough power, you just had to figure out how to use it differently than what you had before. Where does that fit in today? Why is it that we, as white Americans, feel like we have to keep power from Black or people of color of any sort? Why do we feel like we have to do that? Instead, is there a way for us to band together differently?
Jim, I think there's always a chance to use power positively.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I think underneath what you're saying. It bothers me that you keep saying at the expense of others, because I think some of us are beyond that level, certainly. But I think, you know, our society as a whole, yes, is still floundering around in that inability to be a group that is that looks out for everybody. But I think that the idea of power is, I mean, we can use our power for a lot of different things, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing.
It doesn't have to be. But the reason I say at the expense of others is because sometimes I get that power very easily, but I get it in a way that somebody else can't access as quickly, especially if I grasp it too much. If I am using it in a competitive way, whether or not I realize it, against that other person. Men did that to women for centuries, right? We
We're still doing it.
We're still doing it. Thank you for correcting me there. Men hold on to that power very strongly instead of trusting that men and women together can hold power, right? And Black and white together can hold power. We don't have to be in competition. Leticia?
When I hear, and no offense, Marty, but when I hear, why should I give up my power? As a person of color, what power that I bring are you afraid of? Because each culture has very powerful strengths that, if allowed into the society, makes the society stronger overall.
Exactly.
And the hard part is it will change things. For example, as women grasp their power more, I think one of the things that's happening in male America is we're trying to say, well, wait a second, I had really easy, clear definition before. I just went out and earned the money for the house, and then I came back and she had to do everything else. That was a very clear and easy thing for me. And so the sharing of power more means that I have to step into roles that easy definition hadn't given me. I have to wash the dishes sometimes, right? I have to care about.
Sometimes?
Well,
What Joni doesn't make you wash the dishes every day?
Well, we have a
kind
deal
of-
where whoever cooks doesn't clean. And so
Oh, okay.
since she usually cooks, I usually wash the dishes. And when it's my turn to cook, we go somewhere.
Well, we're not
But
talking
power-
about sexism.
Power doesn't have to be power over, though.
It does not have to be. That's exactly what I'm trying to say, Judith, is somehow we have to do it differently. I'm sorry, I kind of interrupted you. Go ahead.
Oh, I was
No, that
saying
was
is
all I
that-
wanted to say.
Okay.
That's kind of the point I was trying to make. And if we define it as power, one of the words in the last 40 years I learned to hate is tolerance. I don't want to be tolerated.
Oh.
But I think that's also what Ibram Kendi is trying to do. He's trying to make us question if some of our words are as effective and as useful as what we think they are. and make us start
Like you were talking,
differently.
when you were talking about introspection before, there's the power over self versus the power over others.
Yeah. Let me give you an interesting other way to think about all this. I like science fiction novels, mostly because science fiction can dream in ways that having to stick to the truth is limits you, right? And science fiction isn't limited by that. They can dream it, they can write it out. And so David Brin is a favorite author, and he has a set of books called The Uplift Wars. Okay, and what this is, one of the key elements to this is that as human beings, part of our job is to see which other species we can lift to sentience and help them to discover the fullness of who they are. Now, how wonderful is that, that instead of automatically saying they're a lesser being, that we can say they have the power too, and how do we help them reach it? And so in this novel, you have sentient humans and sentient dolphins and sentient, I think it's wolves. I can't remember what the third species is, but 3 earthly species that are now living side by side, working together to do the things that need to be done. I think the more we can see ourselves as an ally to each other, bringing each other to the fullness of who we are, the more we realize true power, right? If I have to have power over and hold you down so that I succeed, I actually end up with less power. We end up with less power. But these chapters were often about why we did that and how we told the stories about somebody being inferior because of skin color, because of something that we identified and said, that disqualifies them in some way or another, or it qualifies them differently. I was going to say I liked that, but it's really not that. I'm glad he very strongly emphasized how we ranked the races and said white are good because of this, black are not quite as good because of this, right? And we did all these things that disqualified people in a number of different ways. And it made it easy for us to do that microaggression, or as he chooses to call it, in a very deliberate way. Instead of saying microaggression, which is kind of fuzzy, and micro means kind of small, he said abuse. And he called it what it was. And he said, what if we stop looking at those biological reasons? Because after all, we are 99.9% genetically the same. And the hard part is I look at my Zoom thing, right? I look at all your faces and I can see lots of reasons why we're different, right?
Well, we think we look different.
Or we think we look different, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, you go to Africa or someplace, we all look pretty much the same.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you've traveled a lot.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are guilty of the same thing. We don't see people for who they are because we're used to whatever we're used to. It's funny because people will say, "Oh, is that your brother?" And I'll look at the guy and he doesn't look anything like me, but he's white. So, you know, I get that. We do the same thing in the United States with people of color.
We do. Because we've made it too easy to use certain things to define ourselves. And there is a real difference between male and female. But even in that very real biological difference, much of the things of who my wife is the same as who I am as a human being. Right? We have many of the same points of view, ways of acting, ways of being in the world. Definitely much of our biology is the same, even though it's of another gender, right?
When you say biology, I think about this guy Linnaeus. He bothers me as much as David Hume did John. His on page 41, his classifications of man.
Yeah, and he should bother you, Judith. and all the ways that we have picked up on that and told that same story for 400 years should
Yes.
bother all of us.
So now we're bringing gender into it too. I think that that's part of the equation. I mean, I'm very encouraged by gender fluidity. You know that, Jim. And but I also think that it threatens just about everybody. I was talking to a friend of Diane's. You know, she's cisgender, and most people are, and they are very uncomfortable with that. So that's another change that I see happening in the world that I hope is a positive change. I hope it continues.
So John, but why does it threaten us? Okay, so when I first
Because we like to put people in boxes.
yeah, but I don't think it's that simple, John. When I first came here was to St. Francis was right when Supreme Court ruling about same-sex gender weddings could occur, right?
Right.
And the big anti-point about that, what people brought up all the time, is that will destroy my marriage. How? If these two men get married, how does that cheapen whatever you think your marriage is? Right? If these two, if this black man becomes empowered, how does it truly threaten me as a white man?
And a lot of times they tied it into adoption of children. And these are the same people that aren't willing to adopt children.
Yeah. And so the reason why all that was going on was not because something is going to truly hurt marriage. It's because they had to figure out how to deal with things of power. And it's easier in some ways when it comes to power to just denigrate and push the other one outside of that power rather than figure out ways to share that power. Ways to each be powerful.
Well, I wonder how much of that came from the male side of things. I think men are very easily threatened. And maybe I'm being ridiculous, but I think that women tend to be a little bit more enlightened when it comes to gender. Maybe because, no? You don't think so, Leticia?
If they're soundly cisgender, what I've experienced is men and women are equally
Equally nuts.
yeah. And I have a friend, we went out to Brother John's for a meal, and there was a lesbian couple that came in, and the male role for the couple kept kind of making eye contact with me. And my male friend just got really upset, and I'm going, I've always attracted. No, and part of it I think is I really got into Jungian early and really grabbed hold of, yeah, I got a strong male aspect. And speaking as a woman, most women don't like that because cisgender men don't like that. And so, in the conversation with gender fluidity is not addressing that, and I think it would help a lot.
Yeah. Let me broaden it out to this, because I don't know if men or women have harder time, if black or white have a harder time. I think that when it comes down to it, that we set up things within our head that we tell ourselves is correct. And then questions like this make us have to reconsider those things. And it's easier, or it seems easier, for me to say, I'm going to violently fight for what I think is right, rather than let your voice change me. Because your voice changing me seems to be more threatening to me, even if it's true. So at one point he's talking about children And it says the black child is ill-treated like an adult, and the black adult is ill-treated like a child. Well, that's just behavioral patterns. We've decided that that's how we react to the black child or to the black adult. And if you put any other thing there, the woman, the woman child is treated like an adult, while the woman adult is treated like a child, we would balk at that. So why do we allow it to be true for one piece of our society? And why do we legitimize that? We build up
Well,
things.
it certainly was true with Trayvon, and it was certainly true with, I've forgotten the name of the kid in Cleveland who had the toy gun.
Yeah.
You know, that, so I get that. I think that if a white kid was playing with a toy gun, the chances of the police shooting him would be astronomically less.
Right.
Or my wife would say fewer, sorry.
So we build up those kinds of things, though, because it's easier than changing.
Less.
At one point he starts talking about the Bible and he said, here's the justification for why I get to treat black people this way. And I grew up learning the stories of, for example, Ham, right? And how Ham, because of what he did to his father Noah, that cursed his whole lineage, and that's why we have blacks today, and that's why you don't want to. That's the mark of Cain carried on. That's a convenient story to perpetuate racism, right? And more importantly, to say this holy book gives me permission to not have to look at biology. Because biology
That was
is a whole
the
different story.
hardest attitude I ever had to work around.
Yeah.
What's that?
It's a Mormon belief system.
Yeah.
And anybody with olive or black skin carry the mark of Cain.
Right.
And
Right.
it's their duty to be stewards over us because we carry the mark of Cain.
Yeah.
Sort of like Jews and Arabs, I guess. Right, Jim?
Yeah. There's all kinds of stories that we tell in order to justify us moving forward differently than what we should. But the biology, again, we go back to it. We are more alike. The ways we are different is infinitesimal compared to the ways that we are the same. And yet we search in that 0.1% to try to figure out, well, that should make the difference over all of this 99.9% of the things. We have to start telling and expecting other stories than that.
And we have to get to know each other, and we have to be open and, interested in learning about each other. My wife has a saying from Wisconsin that she uses a lot, which is, what a farmer doesn't know, a farmer doesn't like.
Mm.
And I see that every day.
Yeah.
When I was up in Alpine and I was talking about Black Lives Matter at the church up there, people afterwards came up to me and said, well, we don't really know any black people. And maybe they don't. That was kind of mind-boggling for me. But so I don't think of it that way because I know a lot of different people, and I've all through my life gone out of my way, I guess, not intentionally, but just because people interest me to get to know. If somebody's different, then they're more interesting to me. I know a lot of white guys. I don't need to know any more old white guys. So
John, what I heard you say right then is what Jim's family doesn't know, Jim's family doesn't
Right, it's the same, you talked about that. You talked about that up in.
Those are the people you're talking about are all Jim's family up there, right?
Well,
You're right that us mountain men, we can be very stuck in what we already know. But that's the story here. Is that good for us in any way? It's simpler, but does it tell the truth? I love the part of this where he said, genetically, people in Western Africa are more like people in Western Europe than they are like people in Eastern Africa. And we group East and West Africa, we just say those Africans, even though the genetic similarities are more this way than what they are this way. But we don't want to believe that, because guess where we were taking many of our slaves from?
Nigeria, East Africa.
Yeah.
West Africa, I'm sorry.
From West Africa, that's right. And so they have to somehow, we have to justify that great evil that we perpetuated.
Well, that's where the Confederate flag representing freedom just is absolutely, I do not understand how people in their right mind can think that.
Yeah.
But they do.
So the question becomes this: are either of these two areas the ways that you're feeling called to make a difference? Is your heart being dragged towards correcting what's being done today in power areas or understandings in biological areas? Is that where you begin to work out your anti-racism and assert truths into the lives around you? Doesn't have to be, but can you see how that's really important? Important areas to work in?
Well, Diane and I were talking about this morning because of an email from my sister, and I was explaining to her that she's a racist because she's white. She has real trouble. She has a red-white fragility, and when I went camping with my family, I had the same problem. And what Diana said, that until people want to know, I can't, my job isn't to be pedantic and try to explain to them. That's not what so it's very difficult because I'm just supposed to listen to this racist shit and not respond to it, because then I'm being confrontational. But if I don't respond to it, then I'm being weak. I don't know. It's very challenging.
It is very challenging. I hope, though, you heard some things that help you to correct some misinformation that's out there. When somebody says something about biology, do you say, no, here's a truth? Did you hear something about power that says, I look at it this way instead of that way?
Yeah, but I don't hear people talking about eugenics much. They don't do that anymore, or at least I don't encounter that. What I hear is prejudice. I mean, that's whether it's unconscious or not. There was a great article or editorial this week from a guy in Baltimore in the Star that was talking about how he's a racist because he owns a home. He's a racist because he's vegan, and when he runs out of oatmeal at his grocery store, he can go to another grocery store. He's racist because, of all the benefits that we have derived from white privilege. And I grew up in Baltimore, so, that he's talking about 3 miles away from him, is a completely different world. And with me, it was just across 39th Street, or Greenmount was a different world. But people that live in Alpine can't relate to that.
But they can, John. They can ask questions like this. Do you know the Reedhead family down the block? And look at what they live under versus what you get to live under. Is it okay for the Reedheads to deal with that and you to not have to deal with that? It doesn't necessarily have to be a racist issue that brings that about. You can bring it down to what they understand. You can say, where are the places of injustice right here in this area? How up on the mountain are we treated differently than someone? How does Apache County deal with things in a poor way versus maybe what Navajo County next door is doing?
Yeah.
You ask questions like that, and then if you can, you draw them out to that's similar to what the black man in Alabama feels like compared to. Leticia.
Well, and part of the reason I join in on these conversations, all these written about blacks, and they're probably the most attacked minority. But all of us have been assigned that. So you're talking about Alpine. How does she react when she comes in the groceries? The Navajo.
Right.
That's right.
You know,
Well, Hispanic.
and I think areas like Alpine, they look at white fragility, they look at this book and they go, we're not prejudiced, no blacks for us to be prejudiced.
Yeah.
So you can't call me a racist. Yet when they deal with, because I've been up there, I had a kid that lived up there, their body language, their language changes, their tone changes, and they're in front of an Apache.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so do this, John. Talk to them about Navajo and Apache County. You know why Navajo and Apache County are what they are? It's so that white southern counties could control Navajo County in the north. And there's been an ongoing dynamic of which has the power, north or south, Apache County, north or south, for the whole history, because they chose to divide them that way to try to control the Indian vote. It doesn't take long to notice in a place like Alpine how much the Apache reservation, which is mostly in Navajo County, has a huge hold on the dynamics of southern Apache County. So get them talking about White Mountain Apaches.
Well, my contractor had his tools stolen, and he's convinced that it was the Apache workers that he says I referred him to. You know, so
yeah.
Obviously there's prejudice.
Yeah.
But you know, there's also I have to say that it was really disconcerting that every time people got paid, they would get drunk and disappear. That was hard to explain, to put a positive spin on. So that's a real complicated issue up there. But you're right. But I think it's also interesting up there that when I talk to Latinx people, that they all want to be assimilated. It was the word that this guy would use. They say they don't think of themselves as Hispanic. They think of themselves as white. And, you know, that's interesting to me too, because I think that's a defense mechanism.
Absolutely. And part of it, John, to be fair, families like the Bacas in Round Valley have been there as long as any white family has been there, right? They are long time out of true Hispanic community. Does that mean that they can't claim their heritage? Does that mean they don't have very strong traditions?
Well, they hear the racist comments, Jim. I think I told you my neighbor was getting his car fixed by a guy that was a friend of his that lived on our property, who has a nickname, but he's Hispanic. And my neighbor said, well, I'm taking it down to Springerville for them to work on, but they're not like other Mexicans, they work.
Yeah.
And the guy looked me straight in the face and said that. And so if I was Hispanic and I was living there and I was having to deal with a guy like that, I don't know what I'd do.
Sure. But part of what we
John?
have to choose, John, is how we choose to answer that type of question. Because you're right, that was absolutely a racist comment. It was making a generalization that may be not true. And you need to look and say, here's my experience.
Well, I did tell him that,
Yeah.
but that guy is the same guy that later on
I
said
know.
that he knew who I was. And, you know,
Yeah. Here's the
gonna
good news,
approach-
John. Just like with you, it's going to take a long time to change, Jim.
John, the reason why you hear Hispanics, one, especially if they're second generation Hispanics, because assimilation is encouraged, right? Not acculturation. The other thing is, I'm 58 years old again. My birth certificate says Caucasian.
Well, you look Caucasian to me.
I go back east and I'm not pegged as Hispanic, I'm pegged as Jewish.
So just use these two areas to try to say, look, watch this week to see how you see power being used, wielded, refused to some people. See if there's places where you can step in and correct somebody's misuse of biology. And when they say something like, all Mexicans do this, and see if there's a place where you can gently say a different story. You don't have to fix the situation. Chances are it won't. But try to find some boldness of where you can step into that role. Because it's the beginning of that boldness that begins to change conversations around. Because part of why Round Valley continues to say things like that, John continues to be racist, is because they reinforce each other's racism. And a voice that says, not true in my world,
Yeah.
help make the conversation different.
Well, you just need to move back up there, Jim. You need to retire. You know.
Well, we'll find out what happens. I love that area of the country, but not necessarily because of my family. All right, guys, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your struggle in this area. We'll do chapter 5 and 6 next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.